Good day. My name is WEI ZHUANG, and I will be presenting on the paper titled Translanguaging in the Discourse of Malaysian ESL Lessons for Project Paper 1. In this presentation, three chapters of the research will be presented. They are Introduction, Literature Review, and Methodology. In this presentation, some abbreviations will be used. They are TL for translanguaging, L1 for first language, L2 for second language, and ESL for English as a second language. In the introduction, the research background is split into three parts. The first being translanguaging and code switching in English language education. The concept of translanguaging developed as a necessity of discovering code switching to be somewhat delimiting for researchers, when each language was viewed as a separate field of knowledge with different designated functions for community interactions based on specific linguistic structures only, such as grammar and lexicon. Translanguaging has been advocated by authors to be utilized for education practices and research instead. Since TL encompasses technicality of code switching and more so, all manner of language alternations could be accounted for in respect to the efforts of bilingual or multilingual individuals attempting to learn using all their linguistic repertoire and experiences. TL functions include facilitating language, content or higher thinking learning, incorporating first language L1 in learner's target language when summarizing, reiterating, explaining and highlighting important points in a lesson, maintaining the flow of conversation in L2, managing classroom behaviors, developing healthy relations between students and teachers, increase active learning participation of learners, reduce learning anxiety, and promote self-efficacy or confidence for self-directed language learning. The next subsection discusses about translanguaging in Malaysia ESL education. It is considered typical and common among Malaysians to have a broader range of language repository to express their feelings, ideas, and thoughts internally and interpersonally. The occurrence of code switching or TL was in fact evident in researches of Malaysian English language education. This may be due to reasons influenced by localizations of languages seen in society, linguistic landscape, and media in Malaysia. Regarding the teaching of English as a second language in Malaysia, the current Malaysian education policy has aspirations of developing talented individuals who are proficient bilinguals in the Malay national language and English as a second language. The Ministry of Education Malaysia dictated that languages used for instruction from preschool to post-secondary education must be grammatically accurate with emphasis on use of appropriate level of formality in language, so pupils could learn effective communication. Consequently, TL in a Malaysian ESL classroom was perceived to be a last resort, which often branded teachers and students as the inefficiency of teaching and learning ESL respectively. Its effective is used. Malaysia had shown a constant dip in rankings and proficiency in the global EF English Proficiency Index survey over the last 5 years. English teaching and learning strategies employed and recommended by the ministry were not helpful enough for ESL teachers to maintain and produce high proficiency English users, despite their efforts witnessed in reforming the English curriculum. Moving on to the statement of problem, Due to the purist approach to language found in Malaysia's education policy, ESL teachers and students face stigma when practicing TL in the language classroom, although researchers have shown TL behaviors to be common and widespread in ESL education. In spite of the negative views, TL practices were proven beneficial among Malaysian ESL learners for enhancing their comprehension, self efficacy, discipline, and communication when learning in L2 in the classroom. However, concerns over TL through code switching and practices alike exist. The consensus of TL practices as a pedagogical tool in the ESL classroom has yet to be reached from ongoing debates. Therefore, the purpose of the research is to explore the practices of translanguaging by Malaysian ESL teachers in lessons distributed to pupils for language learning, along with the views of teachers and pupils about the practice. This study will be guided by the research questions and aims, such as 1. What are the purposes of translanguaging discourse by teachers in ESL lessons? 2. What are the perspectives of ESL teachers about translanguaging in the ESL lessons? 3. What are the perspectives of pupils regarding teachers' translanguaging discourse in ESL lessons? This research is guided by the framework of multifaceted nature of language learning and teaching represented by the Douglas Fir Group, 2016. This framework expands on the perspectives of educators and researchers about L2 learning and the possibilities of how L2 learners acquire diverse language repertoires. The multi-layered complexity of L2 learning distinguishes three levels of mutually dependent influence as seen in the figure. We can see that L2 learning is an ongoing process that begins at the micro level of social activity, the meso level of social cultural institutions and communities, and the macro level of ideological structures. This study is substantial in providing further information on English as a second language pedagogy and learning. Translanguaging in English language teaching or ESL pedagogy is still a novel concept in institutions that regard monolingualism and language purism as the norm for medium of education instructions. This research seeks to bridge the gap on translanguaging practices in countries with institutional education policies similar to Malaysia. This research is, however, limited to the investigations of translanguaging discourse of teachers found in Malaysian ESL video lessons, available on the video sharing platform known as YouTube. Another limitation would be the study solely focusing on two perspectives only, that are teachers and pupils on the views of translanguaging for the teaching and learning of ESL. The conceptual definitions for this research are translanguaging, the act of switching, alternating, meshing of languages, and sometimes language fusion or hybridity found in discourse. This research will refer aspects relating to code switching under the general term of translanguaging as a shift towards a holistic and integrative perception of languages to be interconnected. Next, first language is the mother tongue or language of an individual first learned or is fluent in since birth. Second language is a language that is non-native to the speaker but is learned as a target language after the individual's first language for school, work, or other communication purposes. For the second chapter, which is literature review, the subchapter L1 in English language teaching will be discussed. The language of L1 in the English language teaching methodology was not an entirely foreign concept, for some of the traditional methodologies consider it as a support when teaching learners L2. This methodology explained that by incorporating L1 in teaching language through grammar translation method, communicative language teaching, and natural approach, it helps educators to assess learners' comprehension, prompt learning engagement, and enhance explanations for learners' understanding. Matamoros Gonzalez et al. Further stated that other methodologies were either completely against L1 use or limit usage to early stages of learning. Overall, the use of L1 is permissible in some of the traditional English language teaching methodologies. However, WEI ZHUANG pointed out the risks of letting learners to employ L1 for L2 learning that were bad habit formation of mixing languages and frequent L2 error use from L1 transfer. About the emergence of code switching in bilingualism and multilingualism, as more people involve themselves in education out of necessity and globalization, multilingualism in the classroom has become more prevalent and common around the world. Despite code switching being a typical happening in education or communities, ideals of a competent language user remained absolute based on standards of a monolingual speaker in a homogeneous community sharing the same language for discourse. Code switching is riddled with negative implications, discouraging researchers, educators, and policymakers to further expand and explore on the practice. Hence, the next literature review will discuss about shifting from code switching to translanguaging. Code switching as a concept for education was contradictory, to which many believed that the use of L1 in L2 education to be a learning hindrance and for the most part disregards an individual's linguistic background as a learning resource. It is found that Goodman and Tastenberg proposed a comprehensive framework for researchers and educators to transition from code switching to translanguaging through highlighting the similarities and differences of each concept as seen in this figure. Hence, translanguaging is a prospective concept looking beyond the limits of code switching for research by mixing all forms of language switching, mixing and meshing through a heteroglossic lens, taking into account all languages to be interrelated for the development of target language in education. To make clear of TL practices that can be done in education of bilinguals and multilinguals, TL frameworks were established and distributed for effective implementation along with assessment. In Garcia's and Hessen's case, the authors presented a macro framework and a micro framework for schools and teachers to practice translanguaging respectively in bilingual programs such as ESL programs. The translanguaging macro framework for schools set goals in creating translanguaging spaces for each language determined, so students can use all their linguistic resources flexibly and meaningfully, whereas teachers can conduct activities that combines language practices normally done in isolation. The authors promoted a translanguaging micro framework as well for classrooms and teachers. Teachers can refer to the micro framework to teach bilingual education classrooms like ESL lessons systematically with a grasp of when and how students as well as teachers can use TL in hopes of maximizing learning. Lopez et al. Proposed a plan of action to gauge bilingual students' skills and knowledge more accurately who are beginner L2 users. Fundamentally, Multilingual or bilingual students should be assessed through their extensive use of existing linguistic repertoires. This comprehensive assessment using TL seen in this framework could then provide information of learners' abilities for teachers to make an informed decision on their progress development. The next subchapter of the literature review will discuss on the translanguaging functions found in research in ESL classroom. Translanguaging was useful in facilitating comprehension of L2 content, such as explanations of ESL grammar and content words. Teachers can request pupils to explain language learned to them or to peers by TL as a type of learning assessment. TL improves classroom management in the classroom. TL practices can aid the building of rapport between teachers and students and increase students' learning interest, while teachers communicate with students through praise, advice, or critique. Learners' anxiety, motivation, learning readiness, and participation can be regulated using TL in the ESL classroom. TL allows teachers to apply additive bilingualism, where learners' L2 and L1 skills are cultivated all together. TL functions as a tool for teaching language with complex, abstract concepts or concepts that require higher order thinking skills. Social interactions and scaffolding of learning between peers and teachers can be facilitated with TL. TL helps dispel unrealistic ideologies of bilingualism and multilingualism. TL could support learners in building their social identity. And lastly, translanguaging practices also encourage teachers in developing their teaching repertoire. In this section, the views of translanguaging will be discussed from research in the ESL classroom. There has been mixed perspectives about the practice of TL in education. In Chu and Fang's 2019 research, students believed TL educators, especially local teachers, can relate to students more and fulfill their learning needs based on their higher intracultural and intercultural competence. As for Sang and Lo's study, Hong Kong children in a bilingual course showed a preference in learning L1 and L2 in a single lesson. According to Akbar and Taki, their research showed that bilingual college students in Kuwait were comfortable in using TL, which improved their confidence and learning abilities. According to Turnbull 2017, pre-service teachers in New Zealand were split into three camps on the idea, where some agreed to the use of TL, some disagreed, and some having mixed opinions of it. In the last section of literature review, recent literature related to translanguaging in the Malaysia ESL context within 5 years of this research, from year 2017 to 2021, were reviewed. Existing empirical research showed that translanguaging studies were sparse, as with 2 papers directly discussing on the concept of translingualism in Malaysia. The remainder papers discuss on code switching as their main concept, which were related to TL in general. All researchers provided insights on possible functions, perceptions, factors of TL in a Malaysia ESL classroom. From this, the researcher will contribute knowledge on ESL translanguaging practices in the Malaysian context. Addressing the research methodology, this study employs a case study research where processes, groups, events, activities, or individuals in a system bounded by time or place are explored using extensive data collection. Discourse analysis will be done to analyze how translanguaging is used in the Malaysia ESL education context. Discourse analysis is used to study the language in use and how it is used in real-world situations. As for the research side, this study will be conducted off-site and online with teachers and students from 2 primary schools in Johor and Pahang and 2 secondary schools in Pulau Pinang and Johor respectively. All primary and secondary schools are of national type schools where the Malay language is the medium of instruction and ESL is taught to pupils as a subject in the schools. The schools chosen had teachers conducting PDPR or teaching and learning at home due to COVID-19 pandemic measures through online, synchronous, and asynchronous methods, where the teachers' ESL lessons were recorded and disseminated on the video sharing site YouTube. The research has selected its participants through purposive sampling, where a sample chosen is informative for the researcher's unique case to gain an in-depth understanding of a phenomena. Hence, the participants in this research are 4 English teachers performing translanguaging in their lessons, and at least 20 pupils who have experienced ESL lessons with teachers translanguaging. The sample is also chosen by convenience sampling with researchers gathering participants from a group that is easily reached. As seen in the table below are the descriptions and details of the teachers. Next, data will be collected after gaining the permissions from the school administrations and the Ministry of Education Malaysia. Video-based observations from the teacher's YouTube channel will be carried out after gaining permission from the participants. The transcript of the video will be written with the researchers' field notes noting instances of translanguaging, where teachers mix or alternate between L1 and L2 during the ESL lessons. The researcher will request permission from the 4 teachers to answer the questionnaires online and have at least 5 of their pupils to answer a similar questionnaire as well. The questionnaires for students and teachers will be adapted from Yu 2017 in her research into perceptions of code switching. The questionnaires will be modified further to investigate the perceptions about translanguaging from students and teachers. The questionnaires will be distributed and collected from participants using an online survey site. For the data analysis plan, the data from the video-based observations will be analyzed and coded based on themes related to translanguaging purposes and functions. The researcher will use thematic analysis to analyze the ESL video lessons transcript and observation notes with a series of steps proposed by Brown and Clark. Data from the closed-ended section of the questionnaires will be analyzed using descriptive statistics on the SPSS. The researcher will also use thematic analysis on the data from the open-ended section of the questionnaires. The data analyzed from the questionnaires and observations will then be revealed to the participants so the researcher can get confirmation on the precision of their interpretations. The researcher will perform triangulation on the data collected from all instruments so findings are credible and validated. Lastly, this research is guided by 4 criteria to ensure the quality and reliability of the research. This research was planned accordingly to prove its credibility through triangulation of data, prolonged engagement with research participants, and persistent observation on qualitative and quantitative data during analysis. Transferability in this research is possible through the detailed explanations of the research methodology, design, site, participants, instruments, data collection, and analysis plans. The dependability of this research is seen in its research design, data collection, and data analysis plan, where the researcher will follow through the standard procedures clearly stated. Conformability will be achieved by the researcher's documentation of the raw data, data analysis and synthesis documents, process notes of the research methodology, and instrument development data. The researcher will release the research findings to participants as well to confirm if interpretations of data is representative of the participant's voice. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.